So, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the process of industrialization in Pakistan. And as is quite usual, we're going to divide the Pakistan's sort of period of economic development between the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then the Musharraf period in the 2000s. We're not going to cover every period equally. We're going to give more attention to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. 90s and 2000s we'll be covering in even more and greater detail when we look at structural adjustment policies later on in the course. And similarly with the Musharraf period, we'll look at it again in the course. Now, one of the key features of each of these periods is that in each of these periods we've either had military rule or non-democratic rule, or we've had democratic rule or elected governments rather. And it isn't by coincidence, but you'll see that there's a reason why in every period where we have had non-democratic or military rulers, we've actually had higher rates of growth than we've had in the democratic periods. But the main reason behind that have to do with geopolitics, with foreign aid and many other factors. It would be unfair for us to think that elected governments are poorer at managing the economy than military rulers, although that seems to have become the accepted wisdom in Pakistan today. But in fact, if you really begin to examine these things in a little more detail, you discover that this is not the case. So let's start off with the 1950s in Pakistan. When Pakistan was created, let me put it to you this way, that there weren't a whole lot of people who thought that Pakistan would be successful as a viable economic unit. In fact, Papa Nick calls it an economic, he says it was widely considered an economic monstrosity. And perhaps the reason why it was considered in this way is because the region that is today Pakistan was very much economically integrated with India. And people internationally, thought of India essentially in the period of the British rule for the last 200 odd years had been one political entity. Hence, the partition of India was something that the international community wasn't really very, one could say, neither was it very keen or nor could it readily accept it. And so that's one of the main reasons, I think, why a lot of economists around the world thought that Pakistan on its own may not be able to survive. So also in the early period, the government of Pakistan had to deal with all the horrors and difficulties of partition. Both governments of India and Pakistan had to deal with them. The government of West Pakistan in particular had massive migration of about 7 million people. Some people put this statistic higher, some people put it lower, but it is in millions. If we take the number in 7 million, then that's about 20% of the population of West Pakistan, a huge number. Now in the Punjab, that doesn't feel like a huge number because in the Punjab, all the migration that occurred from East Punjab, so from other Punjabis. So when they came to the West Punjab, they settled in such a way that they very quickly and completely integrated into Punjabi society. So even though they may be somebody from Amritsar, etc., you will never guess that they are not from Punjab because they're Punjabis. But in Sindh, the migration has the characteristic that you can see that somebody is a muhajir, is from outside, quite clearly because they are non-Sindhi, etc. They may be Urdu speaking and so on and so forth. So the government very quickly had to adapt and control this massive migration. As soon as Pakistan was created, the ISI took over. No, this is not the inter-services intelligence. This is rather import substitute industrialization. Import substitute industrialization is a policy whereby you protect your domestic industry, you protect your domestic economy by imposing high tariffs, and you try to ensure that the domestic market thrives. But ISI can also have the danger of creating an import dependence, a dependence on imported supplies, because of an overvalued exchange rate and protectionism. It can be cheaper to get supplies from outside, specifically oil, etc., and other things, but even other things that help to run industry. And the whole idea behind ISI is that while your commodities are more expensive, importing things are much cheaper. And what is it that you want to import? Mainly you want to import machinery to get your manufacturing off and running. but you might also be importing raw materials, etc., for that machinery. So importing machinery was very, very cheap back in the 1950s. Exporting whatever it was that we were exporting, the prices were very high because overall Pakistan's, you'll see, currency was overvalued. But what ISI is trying to address is this situation here, that although Pakistan produces 75% of the world's jute in 1949, it did not have a single jute mill. It produced cotton, it didn't have cotton mills. Whatever it produced were raw materials, etc., which inevitably it would send to parts that were in India, where these things would be processed. So that had to be overcome. What you see from this is the average rate of duty on imported goods by the type of commodities. When you look at consumption goods over here, what do you see with respect to what are considered luxuries? You see almost a 99% duty, 99% duty, 140% duty, 142% duty. Whereas essential items, you see that the tariff rate is actually very, very low. So this is called a cascaded tariff structure, where certain things are considered to be luxuries and the duties imposed on them are extremely high. And Pakistan still has that, but it created this cascaded structure all the way back in the 1950s. So that's how, to answer your question, you protect your foreign exchange and protect local industry is through this cascaded structure. Now, although there is significant growth in this period, large-scale manufacturing, in fact, grows by 23.6%. That's phenomenal. That's an incredible rate of growth, right? And then it continues to grow up to the 1960s by another 9.3%. That's absolutely fantastic. Investment more than doubles. But this causes, and this might come as a surprise to you, no significant increase in per capita income across Pakistan. The GNP per capita grew by only 0.2% from 49 to 54, and by nothing between 54 and 60. And the reason why this is the case is because when you have zero industry, if you have no factory anywhere in Pakistan and you create one factory, what is the rate of growth? 100%, exactly. So when you start from a very low base, even if you build 5 factories, 10 factories, that gives you a very high percentage, but it does not have any significant impact on a country of over 100 million people, 150 million people, because it's just 5 factories, 20 factories at the very most, right? So this data is very high in percentage, but its impact on GDP or GDP is in fact quite low. The other major thing is that agriculture in fact was suffering. Agriculture was not growing. It was not even keeping pace with population growth rates. As a result, per capita consumption of food grain was declining in Pakistan. And very early on, Pakistan had to apply for PL 480 and other things where they had to get aid in the form of grain, etc., which the Americans provided. So the major impact of economic policy in the 1950s was to transfer, even though agriculture is not growing, was to transfer income away from agriculture and from urban consumers and to the new and rapidly growing manufacturing sector, says Lewis. Papanik says the same thing. Agriculture was a sick man of economic development. It's already sick, you're further taking resources out of it. Ahmed and Amjad say industrialization was a result of the large tribute paid by the agricultural sector to whom? To industry. This was not a very sustainable model of development, as you can see, although it's causing industry to grow quite rapidly, but this is unsustainable. When you look at the terms of trade between agriculture and industry, you see that if the parity would be that both would be at 100, you see that agriculture is continuously underwhelmed by industry. So resources are moving towards industry rather than the other way around. Now, in 1949, the United Kingdom decided to devalue its currency, the pound sterling. And the rupee at the time, you must understand, was very much connected to the pound sterling because before 47, the British government ruled India. So 9 countries in total, when the British devalued their countries, 9 countries followed and also devalued their currency because a lot of their trade was with Britain, etc. These were Commonwealth countries that were under British colonial rule. India also devalued. But Pakistan took the decision not to devalue its currency. This is very significant because a lot of people thought Pakistan and India would more or less follow the same economic policies, etc., etc. And Pakistan's hope was that India would continue to buy jute from Pakistan, which it had been doing up to that point, etc., at the new higher rates. But India decided not to buy any more jute from Pakistan. They suspended all trade because we didn't devalue, and the jute that they were getting from us was now more expensive to them. So this cessation of trade between India and Pakistan had a bigger and disproportionate impact on East Pakistan. In West Pakistan, 50% of West Pakistan's trade was with India, whereas 80% of East Pakistan's trade was with India. So you see that Bengal, East Bengal, was very much connected with West Bengal and with, the political economy of Calcutta. So that partition of Bengal and then the economic partition of Bengal has a bigger impact on East Pakistan than on West Pakistan. So the crisis was now, where do we sell all this jute? We've decided not to devalue. What's going to happen? Well, we got very lucky. Because in Korea, war broke out. The Americans decided that they're not going to let the Kim Il-sung and the communist government of communists of Korea, they're not going to let them take over. And so they declared war on Korea, which lasted for 3 years. This caused jute prices as well as cotton prices and many other prices all over the globe to go up. So demand went up enormously because you require these commodities to go to war. And America had a big war machine, and it was buying up these commodities from the world market. And so Pakistan could sell these things. So this is the Korean War boom. 3 years, despite not devaluing our currency, people made a killing. And it worked out well, got lucky in the sense that had we not devalued and had the Korean War not occurred, then, given the elasticity of jute and cotton, etc., we would have suffered. But given this massive boom in demand, we made a lot of money. To say we made a lot of money, of course, means people who were selling this stuff made a lot of money, not ordinary people, right? So in the 1950s, we had an overvaluation of the rupee. We had very strong controls on imports, exports, and international trade, specifically on imports. And of course, these were imposed by a differentiated tariff structure, what's called a cascaded tariff structure. Big duties on luxury items, lower tariffs on intermediate capital goods, etc. Also control over consumer goods and easier access to machinery, capital goods, raw materials, etc. Anything that would promote industrialization, you have very few import duties. Also, you had licensing. You had to apply for a license to import anything you wanted to. You could not import things without a license. And the people who were sort of importing or exporting those specific things, whether it is indigo or whether it is jute, etc., they were the ones given the license. So ordinary people could not just simply go, or other manufacturers could not simply go and say, oh, I want to import this or export this. So the 1950s, from 50 to 53, you get the creation of the first major industrial capitalist class. Before that, you have essentially traders and agriculturalists, but now you get industrial capitalists. What these folks do, essentially they're traders in jute and cotton, is that once they get all this money from the Korean War boom, they begin to now create mills and plants to process this cotton, this jute, etc., etc. At the time, there weren't significant alternatives. Banking was much stricter than it is today, so it's not like capital could move so easily from Pakistan. You couldn't send your money so easily to a Swiss bank, etc., etc. Today, banking has become much more easy. The Middle East boom had not taken off, so there was no lucrative market within the region where you could take your money and invest it. So the trading class that made most of that money decided to invest it into Pakistan. And also this is a period of, relatively speaking, optimism in the future of Pakistan. People were not so pessimistic as you are today about the future of Pakistan. By and large, they thought, this is our country, this is where we're going to invest, and so on. So there was this investment. So Lewis, for example, concludes that between 51 and 55, almost the entire industrialization of Pakistan, whatever growth in industrialization that occurs can be credited to the import substitute industrialization policy, ISI, as I meant. Traders now became capitalists. Now, but there is a problem with this kind of capitalist development. Two problems, in fact. The first, of course, is that you may have already noticed that the entire development of industrial capitalism is very much connected to the international political economy. It's not connected to the domestic economy. Tariff barriers, licensing, the value of the international value of the currency, these are the essential tools that governments continue to use even till today to boost industrialization, because industry is entirely geared towards the foreign market and really not geared as such towards the local market. And secondly, unlike the industrialization that occurs, let's say, in the United Kingdom during the Industrial Revolution, or in the US, or in France or Germany or whatever, which really, you get a lot of these little workshops coming up in the north of England, for example, and then they sort of develop into these big industrial enterprises. So you get this sort of bottom-up capitalism developing. It's very, very spread out. And then over time, through competition, people, these sort of larger industries emerge. Here in Pakistan, you see right at the outset that you have a highly concentrated monopolistic kind of structure, which is essentially driven by the state and by the international political economy. So 7 individuals, families, or foreign corporations constituted a quarter of all private industrial assets. Only 24 units constituted nearly 50% of all private industrial assets. So that's 24 factories account for half the industry of Pakistan. Means, of course, that very few people control the industry of Pakistan. And this starts right at the beginning. Agriculture remains sluggish, and so overall GDP growth is also sluggish. If you look at the statistics over here, minus 9.1%, minus 0.8%, etc. 1.8, 1.4, 1.9. Maximum, if it grows, it's at 2.6 or 2.3. So very sluggish growth in agriculture. Keep in mind that Pakistan's population is growing at 3%. There's only 1 year where you get this 13.6% bumper crop, but Pakistan's population is growing much faster. So what happens to GDP as a result? Well, aside from this bumper year where you get 9.4, aside from that, your average is actually quite slow. The overall average between 1950 and 54 is 3.3%. Between 54 and 58, it is 2.9%. Not very fast. Although by today's standards, this seems much faster given the standard rate at which you're growing in near Pakistan. But anyway. The government at this time also creates some very, very important institutions that are going to be at the heart of Pakistan's industrialization. And this is, first of all, the Pakistan Industrial Credit and Investment Corporation, PICIC, then the Pakistan Industrial Finance Corporation, PIFCO, then Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation. This is one of the most important ones. And these people, they advance credit, they advance loans, they help industrialists take off. They are government institutions that are helping industry take off by providing loans, investment, and other things. In 1958, 66% of the loans made by investment made by PIDC in West Pakistan was made in West Pakistan. Similarly, 62% of foreign loans went to West Pakistan. So you can see that the emphasis on industrial takeoff was mainly focused in West Pakistan. And it was also mainly focused in a few families within West Pakistan. The picture that you saw emerge in the Green Revolution is even more focused and concentrated here than it was in agriculture. And it is also the case that West Pakistan had a continuous trade deficit, international trade deficit, whereas East Pakistan had a continuous trade surplus. Hence, most people have concluded that the money that we made from selling jute was utilized by PIDIC, PIFCO, and PICIC, etc., essentially to fuel industrialization in a few families that belonged to West Pakistan. Here are some examples of the surplus and deficit, etc., that you can see. This is Pakistan's overall balance of payment East Pakistan balance of payment and West Pakistan balance of payments, throughout you can see that East Pakistan is in surplus. It is selling more than it is importing. And nearly throughout you can see that West Pakistan is in deficit. It is buying more than it is selling on the international market. And essentially a lot of what it's buying is machines and industrial equipment, etc. So, whereas the overall balance of payments is something of this sort here, right? Sometimes it's in deficit, sometimes it's in surplus. But essentially, wherever it is in surplus because of the exports produced by East Pakistan. So that more or less sums up this very early period of West Pakistan's history. Along comes Ayub Khan, and the 60s become what we now refer to as the decade of development. The growth rates in this period are actually really quite fast. One of the key reasons why growth rates now accelerate, one of the key political changes that occur is that whereas Pakistan was more or less aligned with the United States very early on in the Cold War, it made no major commitments as far as the Cold War was concerned. But now in the mid-1950s and from 54, 56 onwards, Pakistan makes two major and very important commitments to the United States, to the capitalist bloc within the Cold War. It joins, first of all, SEATO, that is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. This treaty organization is essentially aimed against communist China and Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, also Malaysia, etc., where there are communist insurgencies going on. Communists are also very strong in Indonesia and, of course, in Korea, etc. So it is to block the further gains in the East. Who's part of it? Australia, France. You'd be surprised. Why is France part of it? Okay, Australia makes sense. It's in that part of the hemisphere. Because France has major interest in Indochina, in Indochine, which is Vietnam, basically. They are the ones occupying and holding on to Vietnam, if you remember. New Zealand, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, United Kingdom, which has very strong interests in Singapore, Malaysia, etc. And, of course, the United States. The pact continued till about 1977 when it was finished off. Similarly is the Baghdad Pact, also known as CENTO. Before that it was known as METO, the Middle East Treaty Organization. But most people know it as the Baghdad Pact. Who did that include? It included Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, UK, and later the United States as well. And what was this aimed at? This was again a Cold War pact aimed against the Soviet Union, and also in this particular instance against the revolutions that were breaking out in the Middle East, for example, Nasser's revolution, the Egyptian revolution, etc., and in the Middle East, national liberation struggles, etc., that were breaking out, which the Americans and the West at that time thought would quickly align with the Soviet Union, hence it was very important they felt, to stop them. Here are some pictures of when SEATO was created. That's the president of Philippines, Marcos, signing the treaty. SEATO again, meeting, etc. You can maybe spot a Pakistani flag up there. I don't know. That looks like a star to me. Maybe that's the Pakistani flag. But you can see it much more clearly over here. And that, of course, is the Pakistani foreign minister signing the Baghdad Pact. Again, Pakistani delegates at the Baghdad Pact. Now, why is this significant? It's significant because in the 1950s, these third world countries had fought against these colonial powers to gain their independence. And the Baghdad Pact and CENTO were not just seen as anti-communist pacts, but more importantly, they were seen by many other third world countries as being pacts that would continue the system of the domination of the former colonial powers and would prevent national liberation movements from emerging. Anyway, so the result of the assistance and aid that we got, both in terms of finances, in terms of, perhaps more importantly, in terms of technology, you can see had a huge impact in the Ayub period. If you look at the growth rate patterns over here between 58 and 64, You see agriculture accelerate from 3.0 to 6.2. You see large-scale industry sort of continuing at 13, 14%. And if you look at overall GDP, it is also accelerating from 9.8, 5.2, 7.2, etc. Much faster rates of growth, averaging out at 6.5% rate of growth. Large-scale manufacturing is growing at 16.9%, continues to grow in the second Ayub period by as much as 10%. The difference, though, is that, as Papanik puts it, that in the 50s, the trend of large-scale industries is continuing. 50s, it's growing at the same pace. 60s is growing at the same pace. But the difference between the 50s and the 60s mainly is that whereas in the 50s, the agriculture was not growing. In the 60s now, industry continues to grow at the same speed as it was growing in the 50s, but now agriculture also rapidly catches up. So both sectors are growing much faster. And that's the main sort of essential difference between these two periods. The trade policy, Ayub's trade policy is similar to the 1950s. He creates the Open General License Scheme, which is basically now more manufacturers could apply for import licenses. Now, these licenses meant more or less that those particular manufacturers or exporters, importers had a monopoly on that particular trade, which is a sort of guarantee that they will do well. So the capital becomes very, very secure. It's a very risk-free sort of investment because in a certain sense, the government is protecting you from any form of competition, domestic or international. The downside of this, of course, is that too much protectionism of an industry can also make an industry uncompetitive because they're not incentivized, therefore, to update their hardware and their machinery, etc. Now, as what you pointed out in the earlier in your question was, with an overvalued exchange rate, your imports would be very expensive, your exports would be very cheap. So the government also created this thing called the export bonus scheme or the bonus voucher scheme. It's the same thing in 1959, whereby if you exported, you got a voucher in terms of a proportion to the total volume of your export. So if you exported goods worth 10 million, you got a voucher in proportion to that. And you could use that voucher not just to import commodities, right? But, immediately, you didn't have to apply for anything. You had that voucher, you gave the voucher, you imported stuff. But you could also sell that voucher on the open market, on a free market, and make money from it. So you could sell it to somebody else who wanted to import it. So the impact that this had was that for those people who were importing and exporting who had the licenses to do this stuff, the actual exchange rate that they were facing was different from the official exchange rate that existed. So the government basically, in a certain sense, was compensating exporters by giving them these vouchers. It was promoting exports by doing that. They also created a free list of things that you didn't need a license for. This rose from 4 to about 50 commodities that you could buy and sell anytime. Import or export anytime. Now, let me introduce to you this very important concept called total factor productivity. This is also referred to as total factor productivity growth. What this measures is essentially the amount of output per unit input. So if I have made an investment of 10 lakh rupees, what is the output that money produces? What this measures essentially is how productive your economy is. How much you are growing by merely just expanding production versus how much you're growing by becoming as an economy more productive. So the contribution of expanded labor and capital, when you minus that, then you discover how much you're growing. And you want TFP to be high. If TFP is high, that means you're technologically advancing. If TFP is low, that means your GDP is going up, but there's no major technological advancement. You understand? So for example, if I buy and sell land, like real estate agents, if I buy and sell land, and the exchange of land occurs, but there's no new development on that land, the TFP will remain very low. Real estate generally will not develop TFP, right? Real estate boom will not have any major impact on that, right? But if I import machinery and so on and so forth, industrialized technology, IT, this, that, and the other, that will have a big impact on TFP. So Asad Said says that TFP was growing at about 5.06%, And this is actually very, very good. It's very high. The reason why we're looking at TFP in the 1950s is because we're going to compare it then to TFP in the 1980s. And you can look at various periods of growth and see, you might say that in the Zia period, for example, you get 6% rate of growth. But are you getting new technology, or is it just that you're having a good time and blowing it off all away? So here you can see that look at the rate of growth in manufacturing, etc. And they're quite substantial in the 60s and between the 60s, 65, from the 1960s even to the 1970s. Robust growth in manufacturing. You can see that as a breakdown in food, beverages, tobacco, textile, etc., woodwork, furniture, etc., paper, many other things. Chemicals is exhibiting really, petroleum is exhibiting really very fast rates of growth, but you can also look at metals and machinery and so many other things. And if you look at machinery, for example, electrical machinery, transport equipment, machinery in general, you see that they're growing quite rapidly in Pakistan in this particular period, which is what's causing, of course, growth in output. Here's the, TFP in terms of different sectors. The overall TFP is 5.06. You can look at where it's significantly growing and where it's not necessarily growing. Rubber plants, leather, it seems to be growing. Tobacco, it seems to be growing, etc. Paper and other products, not really. So sector-wise breakdown. And you can also compare it to what other countries were doing at the time. To compare it to other countries, you discover that aside from Korea, in this particular chart, we are growing. We have a higher TFP than anybody else. We're importing a lot more technology, and we're becoming much more productive than we were before. So that's not a bad thing. And in fact, I think there's a few countries that were ahead of us. We were ahead of most countries in this particular area. But it's very important for me to emphasize to you what the role that foreign aid plays in the Ayub regime. Foreign aid increased from 2.5% of GNP. You know what the difference between GNP and GDP? GDP is what occurs in your boundaries, in your territory. GNP is what is earned by Pakistani nationals wherever they may exist. So in the old days, GNP was used much more than GDP, and then all over the world economists switched to GDP because they want to look at what's going on in your territory rather than what's happening by people who have a Pakistani passport. So foreign aid increases all the way up to 7% in the Ayub period of your GNP. That's very, very large, right? 7% of your GNP is just going to be driven because you're getting all this assistance, aid, etc. Asian Development Bank also agrees and says, in fact, the import liberalization that occurred in the Ayub period could not have been done without this large increase in aid. And we were growing faster than South Korea, Turkey, Thailand, Indonesia, etc. In fact, our manufacturing exports were greater than these four countries combined. So that's quite significant. But that's not saying much because these countries were also really just now starting out. So Papanik agrees and says, without foreign aid, the rapid increase in development in the 1960s could not have been possible. Griffin, the entire social and economic system that had been built was heavily dependent and supported by and sustained through foreign assistance. Rashid Amjad, Pakistan became a foreign aid dependent regime. This became a very important a sentence or phrase rather that a lot of people have used in turn after he wrote it, foreign aid dependent regime. And sadly, once the aid was stopped, the growth also stopped. It's a very important thing for you to consider that after 200 years of colonial capitalist development, first world countries are so advanced in comparison to third world countries that with a very, very tiny percent of the assistance and aid that they provide, they can raise entire economies incredibly rapidly. That indicates the gap between the rich and poor countries of the world in which we live in. And that gap, by the way, was less in the 1950s and has escalated today. So it's not hard for a country like the United States of America, let's say, to pick up a country like Pakistan if it makes a strategic decision to do so. The policy of the Ayub government, the economic policy of the Ayub government has been, is referred to as functional inequality. The word functional you can just get rid of, just call it inequality. the deliberate creation of inequality. How could that be justified, you may ask? Hamza spoke about it in the last debate, etc. So what was the justification for deliberately creating inequality in society? You have inequality because, well, some people invest better, some people work harder, etc., right? But this is the government making sure that you have more inequality. Kind of seems counterproductive. But the logic of it was to utilize this, the social utility of greed. It's a deliberate concentration of wealth in a certain class. Janbujh ke, you're actually concentrating wealth. The idea is, very simply, that the rich, because they're already rich, will save a greater and higher percentage of the money given to them and reinvest it. Whereas if that same money is given to poor people, they will not save and invest it. Rather, they would use it to buy better food, have better housing, send their kids to school, and so on and so forth. So rate of savings has to be pushed up. World Bank was also advising all the governments of the third world that you have to push up your rate of savings. If your rate of savings is high, your rate of investment will be high. If the rate of savings and investment is high, then the economy will grow much faster, which is true. But then how do you push up the rate of savings? You push it up by focusing, at that time, the government of Pakistan pushed it up by focusing wealth, concentrating wealth deliberately into a few hands. So as Ali Chima puts it, resources were directed towards he calls it the industrial sector, let's call it, euphemism for really industrialists, because they had a high propensity to save. And agriculture and wages should bear the brunt of this transfer. That means basically peasants and workers. Income was taken away from peasants and workers and focused into industrialists. Rashid Amjad points out in his very famous study that by the 1970s, there were essentially 44 monopoly houses. They controlled 77% of the gross fixed asset of all manufacturing companies listed on the Karachi Stock Index. These firms controlled 35% of all assets of the entire large-scale manufacturing sector. So 44 companies controlled nearly 80% of industry. 7 of the banks were under the direct control of these 44 houses, and they accounted for 60% of total deposits, 50% of loans and advances. And of course, these companies had an interlocking directorate system, so this was a closely tied elite, which was also closely tied to the bureaucracy. So you see here the emergence of a picture where you have a small elite which is very closely tied to each other as well as to the bureaucracy and the army. 65% of total loans dispersed by PICIC went to 37 monopoly houses, with the largest 13 of these accounting for about 70% of these loans. So, the vast majority of loans are being made to those hand-picked families. And then finally, Dr. Mehboob ul Haq's famous report said that 22 families controlled 66% of industrial assets, 70% of insurance, and 80% of total banking assets. When he said this in a press conference, it caused a furore all across Pakistan. It was the conclusion of a very famous report that he was writing on industrial concentration. It caused such a scandal when he said this out aloud in the press conference that after that he never released the report. He said, if I release the report, it's going to be even worse. Habib Jalib famously wrote, दीप जिसका महलात ही में जले चंद लोगों की खुशियों को लेकर चले. अब आपको समझ आई कि दीप जिनका महलात में ही जले is referring to the 22 families. So this caused now Ayub's downfall. This model was very unsustainable. Well, that song woke you up, I'm glad. All the statistics and data were like, putting you to sleep. Anyway, so sugar crisis. Sugar prices rose by 15% in 66, then 10% in 67. And everybody was very, very angry about the rise in prices. By the way, how much are food, what is the inflation rate in Pakistan right now?
14%.
Correct, 14.06%. And what is the food price inflation rate of Pakistan right now? It was, 15%, 10% caused a major crisis in the time of Ayub. What is it right now in Naya Pakistan? It's all the way up to 25%. Yet, no major revolt against Khan Sahib. At the time, lavish housing, consumer durables, provincial inequality, all of these caused a lot of resentment, huge movement against Ayub Khan. Here's another example. Between West and East Pakistan, per capita income in West Pakistan was only 10% higher than in East Pakistan. But by 1964, this was now 30% higher in West Pakistan. So first we were 10% higher than them, now we were 30%. Now these are huge countries we're talking about, right? These are huge populations. Countries at that time is one country, but these are huge populations we're talking about. And these are huge numbers we're talking about for income to rise from 10% to 30% is a massive jump. But the inequality between East and West Pakistan is definitely growing and growing very, very rapidly. So what's happening in the index of disparity? 59, if we take that as the base year, by 1969, a decade later, you can see that the inequality index has gone up almost 100%, from 100 to 191. So the Bengalis can really feel that, the way in which industrial development in Pakistan is occurring is leaving them way behind. Here's some more data. 49, the index of disparity, West minus East divided by the West. If you look at it in terms of proportion, it goes from almost 18 to 38. So you see that it is rising quite dramatically.